Hi, Nima. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure being on your show.
Let me start with what Donald Trump said just moments ago. He posted on his through social. I think it says that Iran has just informed us that they are in a state of collapse. They want us to open up the Strait of Hormuz as soon as possible, and they try to figure out their leadership situation, which I believe they will be able to do. Who's communicating to Donald Trump in the United States that he feels this way and that Iran is collapsing? What is your understanding of what is happening? Basically, it's not just about what Donald Trump just tweeted. There is some sort of understanding in mainstream media and by the Trump administration that there is some sort of fracture, division, and they're collapsing. What is happening?
Well, maybe Kushner changes his voice in the next room and speaks on as if he's as if he's calling from Iran, telling him that we're collapsing and please open the Strait of Hormuz and all that. Obviously, no one is communicating with Trump, and no one is speaking about Iran's imminent collapse or whatever it is that Trump says that the Iranians are saying. I mean, it doesn't even make sense. Why would the Iranians communicate with him and in the first place, and why they just rejected his attempt to impose talks in Islamabad? So that doesn't make sense. And obviously, Trump is not saying much about what the siege on the Strait of Hormuz that he's imposed is causing for the entire world. The global economy is reaching a very dangerous point, that tipping point that some people were talking about in some areas has begun. And I think over the next 10 days or so, we're going to see the problems increase very clearly, visible problems across the world as a result of these policies. For Trump is that I assume that he may be hoping that he will outlast the Iranians, but again, it's like the 39-day war. It's like the Ramadan war. The Iranians are fighting for their survival. Trump is fighting a war of choice. Now, whether that war is a violent war or whether it's siege warfare, in either case, the Iranians are going to be very resilient. They are a very resilient people. I think across the world, people have already seen how the Iranians have managed the war beyond anyone's expectations from what we're seeing, from the reactions that we're seeing across the globe. And I think that when it comes to siege warfare, it'll be the same. Of course, it's going to be difficult. And of course, the Iranians are going to have shortages. But what Trump is doing to the entire world is going to be more difficult. It's going to be worse. Because Iran is a country that has lived with sanctions. And as you know, there were years where we exported almost no oil under Trump's own maximum pressure sanctions for, I think, like 3 years or so. I don't know exactly how long, but for maybe up to 3 years, we exported almost no oil. As far as I recall, most of the oil that we exported was like a 100 or so thousand barrels of oil a day to China, and that was we weren't receiving money for that. That was for something that they'd already done. They completed a project, they carried out a project, and this was this was Iran's commitment in return. So for a period of time, the only oil that, or the more or less the only oil that Iran was exporting was oil that Iran was not making any money through as a result. Very little money was made for a period of time. So that doesn't make things easy. Things will be difficult, regardless of how effective the siege is or the siege is not. That's another point. How many ships actually go through? How successful the Americans are in blocking the siege? That's something that I've seen you've discussed with your other guests, so I won't go down that road. But the fact is that the Iranians, they know that in this waiting game, the American people, American allies, American politicians will be putting pressure on Trump to end this, because he is making everyone suffer, and no one sees any reason for this suffering except for the fact that Zionists and Netanyahu and Trump have imposed it upon them. Whereas in the case of the Iranian people, they know that this suffering and this difficulty and the shortages will be imposed upon them by an external enemy that has no moral or legitimate reason to carry out this hostility, except for the fact that he is doing it or on behalf of an ethno-supremacist regime that considers itself to be the master race, the chosen people, and therefore it can, impose anything it wants on the rest of the world.
There are some rumors, Professor Marandi, that the United States wants to announce a no-fly zone over Iran, in addition to the blockade happening. Is that going to somehow escalate the situation? Or are we going to see some sort of military confrontations between Iran and the United States?
I don't think it's going to have any impact if such a thing happens, because the Iranian flights are going to continue. And if the United States attempts to target Iranian flights, then that would be war. And then the airspace over the Persian Gulf region, over the countries that are assisting the United States in its war against Iran, such as Qatar, Bahrain, the Emirates, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, they would face a very painful situation. So we'd be going back to war, basically. So if the Americans attempt to do anything over Iranian airspace, it will be difficult. It will be very difficult for them. And Iran's key flights, I would assume, are basically to countries to the east of Iran and to the north of Iran. And so the Americans would have to fly over Iranian airspace to airports in the north and the east of Iran, and that would be war. There would be no more ceasefire. The ceasefire would be over. And remember, Nima, we, as I said before, and I don't really want to tire you with repetitive points, which I'm sure I do a lot, but we are entering the hot season, and the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula becomes very hot and very humid. And it is going to become increasingly difficult for the United States to wage war under these circumstances. The Americans have always been careful to launch their wars in our part of the world. There are many wars during times where the weather is good, like when they captured Kuwait, or when they they carried out their illegal invasion of Iraq. It was during the cool season. So in the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf, there are like 6 months of good weather, 5 months of very, very hot and humid weather, and let's say a month on the two between hot and cold, where the weather is transitioning. Right now, we're at that transition stage. It'll take gradually, like let's say over a couple of weeks, in the coming days, by the end of by mid-May, I think, the weather is going to rapidly increase and become very warm and very humid, and so warfare will become much more difficult. So I'm not quite sure the Americans are in a position to, not in a position, but I don't think it would be a smart move for them to engage in warfare. Of course, as we speak, so if the Americans carry out an assault on flights over Iranian airspace, that would be the end of the ceasefire. and the Iranians would retaliate. And if they retaliate, that means that they will get the opening attacks. They will strike out at targets across the region, and that would be, I think, very beneficial to Iran. So a provocation by the Americans could allow the Iranians to carry out strikes anywhere it likes across the region. And at this moment, when the Americans are preparing their troops and their forces, I think that would be very beneficial to Iran. But in any case, this is increasingly going to become a difficult time for the Americans to wage war because of the weather. But yet, the belief in Tehran is that we are close to war, and that the Americans want to launch another major assault, a second chapter to this war. They've brought in lots of equipment, a lot of it, if not almost all of it, linked to ground warfare. And there are different scenarios that the Iranians are discussing for land invasion, and the Iranians are preparing themselves for that. My discussions with people in Iran is that the Iranians are fully prepared. They'll allow the Americans to come in. In some areas, the Americans will face very major problems because the Iranians are very deeply dug in. And in other areas, the Iranians will allow them to come in and make advances, and then they will start targeting them with missiles and drones and other weapons that the Iranians have prepared, weapon systems that the Iranians have prepared for 2 to 3 decades now. Remember, the Americans completely underestimated the Iranian missile and drone capabilities, their numbers. They have no idea how many missiles and drones Iran has. Iran is producing both missiles and drones as we speak. And so when it's clear that they miscalculated those and Iran's air defenses and the Iranian Air Force, when the Pakistani delegation came to Iran, Iranian jets flew with them, and they flew back. When they went back, they flew with them as well. And of course, we saw what Iranian air defenses did when the Americans were attempting to carry out an operation in Isfahan during those days. So, when the Americans have completely miscalculated on Iran's resilience and Iran's military capabilities, then I think we're probably going to see the Americans regret any land invasion. But I think it's quite possible that Trump will carry out an attack because I think he's gambling. I think he feels that he has to escalate. He hasn't used it. He hasn't used the opportunity to use an off ramp. He could have done that when Netanyahu initially accepted the ceasefire after 10 days of delay. And Iran said, okay, we will allow ships to leave the Strait of Hormuz in accordance, extra ships, in accordance with our agreement. Back then, at that point, he could have lifted the siege on ports and said, declared some sort of success and said, okay, let's move on to the next phase of our negotiations. But he didn't do that. He escalated. And so now, since he did not use that opportunity, I think the chances that he will further escalate are high, and therefore the prediction, the belief in Tehran is that a major conflict is near at hand, is close by.
In recent days, we've seen the air defense activities in Tehran and other cities in Iran. What is that? Because some people were talking about that maybe some sort of attacks by drones and something of that sort. Then they said that it was just a test. They were testing the air defense system. What is that, and how capable is the air defense system of Iran today comparing to what it was before the ceasefire started?
I don't think anything serious happened, and I really don't know the state of Iran's air defenses and what capabilities they have. But remember, after the 12-day war, Iran went and improved its capabilities very rapidly over what like 8, 9 months. And after 8, 9 months, when the United States launched a second war against Iran, even though U.S. forces and U.S. Capabilities are far greater than those of the regime, the combined force of the United States, the Israeli regime, and with the logistical support of the countries in the Persian Gulf, except for Iraq and Oman, the U.S. firepower and the firepower used against Iran was much greater. That's why during the 12-day war, even though it was an unprovoked attack, the Iranians defeated the Israelis. But this war, which was much bigger, Iran did, and they performed significantly better, if not much better, than the 12-day war. And so the Iranians, during the past 2-3 weeks, they've been working day and night to prepare themselves for the next phase, and whatever shortcomings they have, find solutions for them to better protect their assets. Also, they've been working day and night as we speak. So I think that probably Iranian air defenses, which have different layers, are better now than they were back then. They're better capable. They've done a pretty good job dealing with drones. I would imagine that they're even more prepared now to deal with drones and low-flying aircraft and helicopters than they were a few weeks ago. Remember, so the Americans, even so, they've been preparing themselves for the last few weeks, but so have the Iranians. It's not as if the Iranians have been doing anything different. And this is Iran's home turf. Iran now knows what the enemy can do, and it's now preparing itself for in order to better deal with its enemy. And I think now any threat that Iran makes is taken much more seriously. The Saudis and the Emiratis and others know that if war is launched against Iran, they are part of this war, because without their consent, without these 5 countries giving consent, and Jordan, but these 5 countries in particular who are neighbors, without them giving consent to the Americans to use their airspace, their land, and the sea, the Persian Gulf in particular, or the Gulf of Oman, without that, waging war against Iran would be impossible. The Americans just simply could not have done it before, and they cannot do it in the days and weeks ahead. So they've seen what Iran's capabilities are. They know what the Iranian response will be to strikes on Iran's critical infrastructure, and Iran will definitely outlast them. Their critical infrastructure is in very close to Iranian territory. They have very large projects. In Iran, you have it's spread. Their critical infrastructure is spread out across the country. It's very easy for Iran to retaliate, to respond, and to destroy those assets. And if it does, that means there won't be any. I mean, the Iranian commander for the missile force said that if we go there, there will be no oil coming from this region anymore for years to come, and that means the global economic depression will be something that the world will be experiencing for years.
Yeah, we had a report on Israeli Channel 14. It says that the IDF officers have been told in a confidential security briefing that Iran is succeeding in restoring parts of its ballistic missile program. They're talking about these 2 weeks of the ceasefire. And do you think, Professor Marandi, we had a meeting after the military commanders of Iran, Russia, and even Pakistan was part of that, but in a bilateral meeting between Iranian, deputy in Kyrgyzstan, that meeting has happened. He said 2 points. One of them is that Iran is ready. America is no longer in a position to dictate its policies to independent nations. Basically, he's talking about Iran. And the second point that he brought up, which is important, that today Islamic Republic of Iran, while preparing for a powerful defense and meeting its needs of its armed forces, is ready to share its defense military capabilities with independent countries, especially the member states of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. What are the capabilities? I remember what has happened to Russia during the war in Ukraine. The United States forced Russia in producing more ammunition, more arms, and literally improving the military industrial complex of Russia. Is that happening to Iran?
Well, no doubt. The Iranian military industry is very different from U.S. military industry. It's controlled by the state, and therefore it does as the state demands. It's not designed to make profits for billionaires and the oligarchy. So Iran can, just like Russia, can produce missiles much faster and much more efficiently and much cheaper than the United States. But it's not just that. I think that what we've seen is not only the unique resilience and resistance of the Iranian people and the Lebanese supporters of the resistance, and Hezbollah has been doing an extraordinary job, and I know you've been covering that separately. But and this is something that the world is witnessing. A colleague of mine, a friend of mine, a Brazilian communist, was telling me just a couple of days ago that he's at a conference and he's in gatherings in China, and everyone is talking about Iran and the resistance. And he was saying a lot of these communists from part of the world, he said they're from Africa, from Latin America, and elsewhere, they were like, half jokingly and half seriously talking about converting to, Shia to Shia Islam, because they see that this ideology is, I'm of course, this is me saying it, but that the ideology is so effective against empire and against imperialism and against hegemony and domination and injustice and the domination of the powerful over the oppressed. So the soft power that Iran has and the resistance has today, and the axis of resistance has today across the world among liberation movements and people who are confronting the empire and who see resistance to empire as key, is extraordinary. And so not only is it, but besides that resilience, that the culture of resistance that exists, is the fact that the people who designed Iran's defenses were brilliant. They have been able to create a defense capability over decades where the Americans, with all their firepower and all their wealth, combined with their proxies in the region, and of course the Israeli regime, which has everything that the West can give to them, they failed. Despite all that firepower, after 40 days they failed, and that has shaken the world. People across the world are talking about the hegemon failing against the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the Israeli regime, of course, failing against the Hezbollah and in Lebanon. And so obviously this doctrine, these capabilities that Iran has, they are I'm sure that armies across the world would like to know how Iran does that. And another thing, Nima, besides Iran's underground bases and its underground factories and its underground assets that exist across the country, air bases underground, air defense systems stored underground. Despite all that, and the fact that most of Iran's missile bases are still untouched, they haven't even been used. But Iran has it's like there's an ocean of missiles and drones. Iran has been producing missiles and drones 24 hours a day for years now, because as they've been building these underground bases, they were filling them up with missiles and drones. And we saw how older drones were used to destroy U.S. assets. Even F-5s were used to strike U.S. targets. So Iran now has an ocean of, literally countless drones and missiles that it can use in the phase ahead. So instead of buying large numbers of airplanes from the West, like other countries do, from the United States, and which would ultimately be useless against such a overwhelming air power, the Iranians designed a defensive and offensive capability, which the Americans can do nothing about. And of course, I think in the upcoming, the quite probable war that we're going to see in the days ahead, most probably, we're going to see a continuation of that. The Iranians don't want war, but we discussed this before. We don't want war. We did not start this war. We did not bring about this economic crisis for the world. The United States, Netanyahu, and Israel and Zionism did that. But the Iranians believe that a longer war is better for us. We've discussed this since almost the beginning of the war. You and I have spoken about this multiple times. The Iranians have prepared themselves for a very long war. So the missile and drone and other capabilities will continue to weaken the United States at a time when the United States is they spent so much of their own capabilities and their munitions that in some instances they're critically low. So Iran will outlast the United States, and countries across the world, military, the armed forces of different countries are watching, and they want Iran, without a doubt, they would like Iran to help them to develop their own capabilities, their own indigenous capabilities. After all, Iran defeated the empire.
Yeah. You mentioned the case of F-5s being used. We've learned from CBS News that Iran has used F-5s in the initial days of the war. Just imagine what has happened. In the initial days of the war, they had all these air defense systems, they had interceptors, radars, everything that Iran was able to penetrate all of them to go to Kuwait and hit the targets in Kuwait, as it was mentioned in this report on CBS News. So what would be the situation right now if they decide, because Donald Trump is in his mind, he feels that the Iranian capabilities in terms of the naval capabilities, the Air Force capability were destroyed. Is that the case? And how could it be for Iran and Air Force to go over these GCC countries, hit the targets?
Well, we saw Iran hit targets. At the beginning, what the Iranians did was they focused on American air bases. But the more the Epstein coalition began to target civilian infrastructure, the Iranians began to retaliate. But one thing, a footnote sort of, that I would like people to keep in mind is that 3,300, 3,400 Iranians were murdered by this coalition, and with the help of Qatar and the Emirates and these other regimes in the Persian Gulf. But look at the numbers of people who died in the Persian Gulf region. There are only a handful. Despite all the destruction that Iran carried out in retaliation, every time there was escalation, Iran responded to escalation. Iran never initiated escalation. So only a handful of people in all these countries combined died. That shows that the Iranians have always taken care not to hit and kill ordinary people, unlike the Americans, who focused on killing ordinary people often in order to create fear and in order to create chaos and desperation among Iranians, and of course the Israeli regime as well. The American Air Force and the Israeli regime's Air Force, they have the same culture of criminality and mass murder. Their pilots are more or less the same. They have the same attitudes. They're criminals. But even in Palestine, the Iranians focus on strategic targets. They did not focus on bombing schools and hospitals. The Israeli regime bombed a synagogue in Tehran, completely destroying it. A synagogue. Why? Because it's anti-Zionist. Did Iran target synagogues in Palestine? No, of course not. So there's an enormous difference between the Iranians and this Epstein coalition and their proxies. And the difference is infinite at the moral level. They have no morality. The Western media has no moral compass, but Iran has been very careful to be moral and not to put ordinary people in danger, even in occupied Palestine, even in occupied Palestine. But in any case, these countries in the Persian Gulf already experienced Iran's power. We saw that when the Israeli regime targeted the South Pars gas field of Iran, the Iranians hammered Qatar's gas installations, the Emirates, and I think maybe it was Kuwait or Saudi Arabia in response. And then, if you recall, Trump social that Truth Social post saying, he did not know about this, and Israel is not going to do this again. Why? Because they saw how devastating Iran's response was. And during the last day, the Iranians hit very hard. And after the Emiratis were foolish enough to strike targets in Iran, Iran hit them back very hard. And the same is true with the Kuwaiti regime, where lots of American forces, by the way, are prepared for land assault. In one of the places is in Kuwait. So these regimes which are preparing, helping the Americans both to carry out airstrikes and missile strikes, they're also helping the Americans prepare to carry out a land assault on the country. So since the Iranians have already destroyed their key assets, I think they know very well that if this war continues, Iran can easily finish the job. And if Iran finishes the job, Qatar will have no gas to export for many years to come. And the same is true with other regimes in the Persian Gulf. So the Emirates can talk about leaving OPEC, but if the Emirates has no oil or gas infrastructure for the years to come, what difference does it make? And remember, these are tiny, puny regimes. In future, the Americans are not going to be able to maintain their bases in the Persian Gulf, and these regimes are going to have to rethink their foreign policy, and they're going to have to behave differently. They can no longer assist countries in murdering Iranians. So the smart thing, since they're so bound to empire and they're so compromised. I mean, some of these people we've seen already that their names are in the Epstein file, even though we've only seen the tip of the iceberg of the Epstein files, and who knows how many other Epsteins are out there.
Professor Marandi, today I talked with John Helmer, our friend of this podcast. He mentioned something. He compared that to what has happened in the on that school in Minab, and 168 kids were killed by American attack. The other thing that has happened was the case of Dana destroyer, Dana frigate, which was attacked by the United States in the initial days of the war when they were on their way to get back to Iran, and they were not armed by torpedoes, missiles. They didn't have it. So they were attacked 2 times. They killed most of the people on the crew members of that destroyer. What is the understanding of that?
The second strike, sorry, just for interrupting. The second strike was so that they can kill more people. So this was a ship that was unarmed. It was coming back from an international gathering of naval ships. The Americans knew it was unarmed. The first strike was more than enough. They didn't even have to strike the ship. It was unarmed. They wanted to kill people. The Americans take pleasure in murder. They're despicable. And so the first strike was to kill people, and then they saw that they could kill more people. So they did a second, just like Minab. In Minab, they used multiple missiles. They knew that these were kids in that school. There's no doubt about that. This was intentional. Minab was intentional. That was the first wave of strikes. The first wave of strikes are very carefully vetted in any war. I've been in war. I've been in major operations. The first day, the first stage of an operation is they work on it for months, if not years. Every position is carefully, and every place that is to be attacked is carefully chosen, because it's going to be the first. It's the first punch. You want to get it done the best. You want to have the most effectiveness. So Minob was a target that was chosen beforehand. That school was there for years. It was on all the Iranian social media apps. It was on the American apps. It was on all the maps. But the problem for those kids, their sin was that many of them were the children of officers. And the Americans wanted to teach the Iranian military officers a lesson, just like their Zionist brothers, just like their satanic brothers in the Israeli regime. How they, as we speak, over the past few days, look at how many Palestinians they've murdered in Gaza, and they snipe little kids. They snipe them. A girl is sitting in class, and a sniper targets her in class, and she falls in front of her classmates. And in Lebanon, they just bomb homes when they know kids are there. They carpet bomb, and then they destroy entire villages and towns. And Western media, what do? Nothing. They look away. They pretend that these are Hezbollah strongholds. Twitter included. When you look at the page of news, they're constantly saying Hezbollah targets are being bombed. They're bombing towns, or they destroy entire villages just out of hatred and spite. But the West doesn't do anything about it. They don't care about it. No sanctions are imposed against the Israeli regime. European officials don't do anything. Not a single European MP, or maybe one or two, but for the most part, none of them say anything about this. So this naval ship was, they struck it even though it was unarmed, and then they struck it again to get more casualties. And even Trump said something about that, about, they can kill more. I forgot what he said, but these are just, these are criminals. And this is the Epstein class. These are the people, this is the class of people who right now, the regime in the United States is hiding their crimes to the American people. They won't release evidence about Epstein, and other Epsteins, of course, are doing what they do. But despite what they've done to the kids, little girls. So what expectations should we have when it comes to the United States and the Israeli regimes? These are two, they're identical. There's no difference between the U.S. Senator and fanatical Zionists who go out and kill kids in the West Bank and Gaza and Lebanon and elsewhere. And Iran. The Israelis also do the same thing. They carry out double tap operations. I've tweeted footage. I think you remember that woman who survived a strike, and she was saying her Shahadatain, and then they fired it was a double tap attack, and she was killed in the second strike. So the Israelis and the Americans, they take pleasure in killing ordinary people.
We've seen the Iranian foreign minister going to Islamabad, then to Muscat, and he returned to Islamabad again to update the proposal, the Iranian message to the United States. It seems that they're basically right now, Iranian position is a three-step sort of plan. The first step would be the permanent cessation of the war. It's on all fronts. It's going to be against Iran, against Lebanon, against Hezbollah, basically, because when they're talking about Lebanon, they're basically talking about the government in Lebanon. They don't care about the people in the southern part of Lebanon or the attacks that they're doing right now in Lebanon. And the first step, the second step would be the Strait of Hormuz, and what would be the future of the Strait of Hormuz. And in the third step, you have the talks about nuclear program of Iran. What is that accurate?
Well, let me put it this way. I mean, first of all, you're right. The government in Lebanon, it's not that they don't care. They have an animosity towards the people of southern Lebanon, and they're puppets of they're U.S. puppets. They were installed after the ceasefire and after Seyed Hassan Nasrallah was martyred, and after Syria, Syria had fallen, so Hezbollah was surrounded, and the Americans thought that now they can destroy Lebanon and put their proxies in place and get rid of the resistance, and the Israeli regime can have its hegemony over Lebanon, just like it has domination over so much of Syria. Now we see that it didn't work out like that, but the Iranians, we have to go back to the beginning of the war. At the beginning, the Americans and many people across the world thought that Iran would collapse within days. And Trump, as like in the 12-day war, he said, I want unconditional surrender. So all that changed until we got to a point where the Iranians said, this is our 10-point plan, and we will negotiate based on this. And Trump said, okay. So he accepted this as a framework. Iran is now saying that this is our focus. Our focus is on the 10 points. The Americans want to talk about the nuclear program. No, that's not our focus. This is a war of aggression. This was an unprovoked war. And our priority is ending this war and ending the siege that has been imposed on the international community, literally by the United States. The United States, by imposing this blockade, it is effectively created a blockade against the global economy, against its own economy, for the sake of Israel, for the sake of Netanyahu, for the sake of Zionism. It's stunning how they're willing to sacrifice the entire world for Netanyahu, which is in some ways, I should be careful how I use my wording. In some ways, it's very interesting that so many of these countries supported Netanyahu's genocide, especially Western countries. And so many other countries were indifferent towards governments, the genocide for 2.5 years. And now they're suffering at the hands of that country that they assisted in carrying out its genocide, or the country that, in some cases, they looked away when it was carrying out genocide. It's quite stunning, I think. But in any case, the priority for Iran now is the 10-point peace plan, the 10-point plan that it put forward, and Trump himself said that will be the basis of negotiations. And the Americans whenever they sit with the Iranians, they want to talk about the nuclear program. For the Iranians, that's not the priority. The priority is what the Americans agreed to, and that is discussing the 10-point plan. And if the Americans want to wage another war, so be it. The Iranians are prepared for it. We don't want war, but we're more than prepared. And as I said, Nima, before, just half an hour ago, I guess, and on previous occasions, Iran doesn't want war. But if there's going to be war, it's best for it to be a long war, because the Iranians want to make sure that by the end of this war, the United States comes to the recognition that it can never fight Iran again. It can never come and attack Iran. It will never do so again. This will be the last war carried out by the United States against the Iranian people and the Iranian women and children. So we don't want war, but now that we have this confrontation, it's best to inflict so much pain that the American people would never again allow their leaders to wage another war, or the United States simply will not have the capability to wage another such war in future.
The second trip of Iranian foreign minister was in Muscat, and it seems that they were talking about the situation with the Strait of Hormuz, how to define a mechanism for the Strait of Hormuz. But beside that, Professor Marandi, I really believe that what is happening with Oman and the GCC countries is so important comparing to what has happened in Europe. For example, if you remember, before the war in Ukraine started, many people were arguing, why is not Ukraine considering being something like Austria, being neutral? not being part of, NATO, not part of the Russian, just being neutral, not part of any. We have that in the Persian Gulf. We have a state called Oman, which is independent. It's not dependent on Iran. It's not dependent on the West. Their foreign policy is mostly independent. And is that the case for Iran, the way that Iran sees a secure region for the future?
Yes, I mean, that's what Iran has been talking about for years, but these countries are so bound to the United States. I mean, even Oman is bound to the United States in many ways, but still it has been independent enough for the Iranians to say that we'll close our eyes to some things. But these other countries, it's worse than in the case of Ukraine. In the case of Ukraine, they installed a coup regime, and then they started attacking ethnic Russians in the east and treating them as inferior beings, and we all know the story. In the case of these countries, they helped the Americans wage war against Iran. Without them, war would not have been possible. And without them now, the United States will not be able to wage another chapter in this war. So this is far worse than what happened in Europe. This is open aggression against Iran. They are a full partners in the war against Iran. They are part of the war. And as I said, they fund the war. They pay for the expenses in these bases, especially the Saudis and the Emiratis, and all of them really. But they fund. It's not as if the Americans have that land for free and they pay for their expenses. These regimes pay for their electricity, their costs. It's stunning what they've done for the Americans in waging its war against the Iranians, and before that too. So if they choose, I mean, one reason why the Iranians are speaking with Oman, of course, as a friendly country, is bilateral ties, the Strait of Hormuz, the United States. The problem of the United States, Oman is not the mediator, but it has a history of mediation between Iran and the United States. So dialogue is useful, but also so that Oman could speak with countries in the Persian Gulf and encourage them to change course. These regimes, these family dictatorships, have done enormous damage to their people, each of them has carried out an enormous injustice to their own people by getting involved with this war. The Emirates thought that they could sit back and have Iranians slaughtered and reap the benefits and pretend that they're neutral. The same is true with the rest of them. Well, that didn't work out the way they wanted, and if the war begins again, it's going to be far worse for these countries, especially as the summer heat approaches. So again, Iran doesn't want war, and Dr. Araghchi is being sent to countries like Oman to see if he can, if Iran can build bridges with these regimes. But if war is imposed, Iran will make sure that the United States and its proxies are punished in a way and that this never happens again.
It seems that Iran has received a second, another request from the United States to hold a new round of talks. Is that happening? Or if Iran decides to do that, what are the conditions or preconditions for that?
The Iranians have said that in order for talks to succeed, the previous agreements have to be the commitments by the two sides in previous agreements have to be fulfilled. So we have a ceasefire deal, and the Americans have not fulfilled their side of the bargain. The Israelis are slaughtering the Lebanese as we speak. They're slaughtering people in Gaza as we speak. Remember, the ceasefire was for the entire region. The reason why Lebanon was named, it's that they said the entire region, but they stress on Lebanon because there was heavy fighting there. But it includes Gaza. The ceasefire includes Gaza. So Americans were violating their side of the bargain. Whether it was Netanyahu or anyone else, it's irrelevant. The Americans committed themselves to imposing a halt in the violence being carried out by the Israeli regime. They committed themselves to that, so they had to carry it out. So they violated that, and then after the ceasefire agreement, they imposed the siege on Iranian ports. That's an act of war. Boarding ships, as they call it, which is, Western media calls them boarding ships. When Somalians board ships, they're called pirates. When the Americans take those same ships, they're not pirates. They board the ships. These are all acts of war. So without a doubt, the Iranians will demand those ships to be returned, the siege to be halted, for the next stage to begin. There's no reason why future negotiations should be held when previous commitments are being ignored, because that basically invites the United States to continue ignoring its further commitments. I mean, when the Americans see that they can have an agreement without carrying out their commitments, then if there's a new agreement, the Americans are going to do the same thing all over again. So the Iranians are insisting that the Americans first abide by their current commitments, and then we can move on to the next stage. There are many ways where Trump can find an off-ramp. But again, as I said earlier, he ignored that opportunity, and we are now where we are. The world is where it is now because Netanyahu will not let him take the off-ramp. The Zionist lobby will not let him take that off-ramp. And therefore, the Zionist regime, the Zionist lobby, Netanyahu, Trump, are moving to wreck the global economy, including all those economies of Western countries and Western-bound countries that supported the genocide in Gaza.
Ursula von der Leyen yesterday was asked about if they're going to lift the sanctions on Iran. She said that, the democracy doesn't exist in Iran. They're killing their own people. She mentioned 17,000 people were killed. You see different scenarios on the part of Trump, the Europeans, all the, they're trying. But what matters the most right now is who has the leverage right now, who has the upper hand, or somehow who has some sort of balance in the way that the Europeans are treating Iran. Iran has a lot of leverage when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz right now. Is Iran going to practice that, to put pressure on them? Because they were sanctioning Iran. They were part of this sanctioned regime for such a long time. And you know the way that they were pressuring, they were inflicting a lot of suffering on Iranian people for more than 46 years.
Yes, and she herself was involved in sanctions that were targeting ordinary women and children in Iran. She is one of the people who has been assaulting and murdering ordinary Iranians through the maximum pressure sanctions that she and her colleagues and her predecessors have been imposing on the Iranian people. So for her to speak about democracy and human rights in Iran is, it's quite stunning. But that's how the West is. They impose wars and they speak about human rights. They slaughter women and children and they talk about children's rights. They allow their allies in occupied Palestine to snipe children for fun, and they call that a democracy. I mean, they've created a dystopia. The world today that we're living in is quite dystopian at so many different levels, thanks to these European and Western regimes. But a few years ago, I was at the negotiations, as you know, when Iran, during the Biden years, and during the late President Raisi's presidency. During that period, there were negotiations between Iran and the United States and the P4+1, and then the United States that had left the P5+1. They were on the sidelines, sort of indirectly negotiating in Vienna. And it was at that time when the war in Ukraine began. And I told many Western diplomats and Western journalists and Western elites, because I was there the whole time and I was constantly meeting people, and in coffee shops and in the hotel and lobby, reporters, journalists, night. I was telling them that you burn bridges with Russia, and the Nord Stream pipeline was destroyed, and the energy sanctions were imposed, and energy ties were cut, and trade was cut. I said, you burn your bridges with Russia. Now you have an opportunity to sign an agreement with Iran, and you can invest in Iranian oil and gas and meet your needs. They didn't, and I said that a European winter is coming, and this will last years. They said, no, no, not one person, not two people, almost all of them, almost every single person, probably every single person, but I'm just saying almost, just to be on the safe side, said this war will be over in a few weeks. The Russian regime, as they like to, whenever they say regime, you can be sure that it's better than them. When they say the Cuban regime, then Cuba is better than them. The Cuba that they're starving right now, we shouldn't forget that they're starving the Cuban people, and maybe you should do a program on Cuba and invite one of our friends from Latin America to talk about what these criminals are doing to the Cuban people and to what they're doing to the Venezuelans as we speak. But they were saying, no, the war with Russia will be over in weeks. Putin will be gone, and we'll have, a different government to deal with. Well, I said that's not cool. This situation will last for years, and you will have an energy problem for years. And this is going to lead, I didn't use the term deindustrialization, that wasn't my term, but others, I don't know, then or later, but I was saying that the European industry is going to go downhill. The Europeans ultimately, they came to a text with the Iranians. And the head of the European foreign policy at that time, he said that the Iranian demands are reasonable. So, and he expressed hope that the Americans would accept, and the Americans did. So the Americans sacrificed the Europeans under Biden in after Ukraine with regards to Russia and Iran, and now they've sacrificed the Europeans, Americans, and the Israelis in the Persian Gulf. So the Europeans have no energy from Russia. They have no energy from the Persian Gulf. Their continent is going downhill very fast. They're in no position to make demands to Iran. They're irrelevant. But the point is that the Americans have sacrificed them in Ukraine and in our region, and they're the ones who are paying the price more than anyone else. Europe, which used to be the empire, the center of empire for centuries, now it's losing its economic, its industrial capabilities. It's become irrelevant, and it's their own doing. So when they speak about Iran and human rights and democracy or whatever, no one takes them seriously. I survived 2 chemical attacks, and when they gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons, and so from my youth, I understood that the West has absolutely nothing to do with human rights and freedom or anything like that. They supported Saddam then. They support Netanyahu now. They support the starvation of people in Cuba. They supported the starvation of people in Syria. And they support anything that the Israeli regime does to the people of our region, whether in Lebanon or in the West Bank or Syria or Gaza or elsewhere.
Professor Marandi, before wrapping up, we had the Iranian foreign minister going to Russia and talking with Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. And who's Russia today to Iran? And what was the meaning of this meeting? What was the main purpose, the main objective of this meeting?
The Iranians helped Russia and Ukraine, and the Russians are helping Iran. The two countries have been working together to also develop the North-South corridor. The relationship has evolved. A few decades ago, the Iranians were as hostile towards the Soviet Union as they were to the United States almost, because the Soviet Union was helping Saddam and the Soviet Union had occupied Afghanistan. And while Iran was not supporting the extremist groups, the Wahhabi Takfiri groups in Afghanistan, it was supporting resistance groups. Iran didn't want a bloody and deadly uh, war in Afghanistan. But in any case, Iran was completely opposed to the occupation. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had a change in mentality in Moscow. And Russia's behavior is very different from what it was back then towards Iran and towards the global majority. And the relationship between Iran and Russia has evolved. And the irony is, of course, that the United States, by antagonizing Iran and Russia, they've pushed them closer and closer to each other. And now the Iranians and the Russians are beginning to recognize how mistaken they were in not pursuing this relationship earlier. The North-South corridor, if the Iranians and the Russians were, they should have carried it out. They should have developed it decades ago. But only after the war in Ukraine did the two sides begin to take it seriously. And other, projects and ideas for cooperation. So the Russians know that the United States is a threat to them, and Iran knows that through the Persian Gulf and through West Asia, and Iran knows that the expansion of NATO is a threat to them. So push the two countries to each other, which is a good thing. And to be very blunt, NATO and the United States in particular, has lost the war in Europe, and they've lost the war in West Asia. And no matter how much they slaughter women and children in Lebanon and in Gaza, and they snipe kids for fun, the Zionists have lost the war. And the world is not only seeing Zionism as utterly evil and genocidal, and Zionists as evil and genocidal, but now they're seeing that Zionism has created misery and is creating misery for people across the world through Trump and the regime in Washington.